All right, here we'll be servicing a Tier Time Upbox Plus extruder. Also the same form factor as the UP300 extruder. Here it's already been removed from the Upbox Plus printer. The only thing holding it in is a Allen head screw that's in this hole right here in the printer. Upon removing that and the plastic cap that covers the cables here, you can gently wiggle and remove the CFC cable from this end of the extruder. There may be a little bit of hot glue on there. It will wiggle loose and pull out. Just be careful. This cable can easily be damaged by bending it too much, so definitely wiggle it back and forth carefully and get it out. That cable will never need to be replaced if this process is done with care each and every time it has to be removed. Otherwise, the cable may end up needing to be replaced at some point. Once it is removed, the rest of this process is actually quite simple. We just have the two fan plugs at the top here. It does not matter which one they go into. They're both fed by the same amount of power. So we can pull these out. If you are curious putting them back in the same place, they do crisscross one another at the top by default. Once this is unplugged, then you will be able to remove this front plastic shroud from the front of the extruder. It pulls straight off. The best way to hold the extruder for this process is with one thumb up on the 16-pin plug and your fingers on the bottom of the motor. If the nozzle is hot, let this cool before removing this from the printer to avoid burning yourself. This also helps prevent breaking the little top fan shroud here and the mount that holds this fan in place. So by holding it this way, you can kind of creep it back and forth. The first time you do this, it can be a little bit harder to pull off, but it does pull straight off the front. You can see it comes with a little bit of force. Essentially what we're looking at is this little rail, this protrusion on this side and one on this side. That's what this slides onto. So you can see the markings on the inside here and over here. So that's what it is. So the first couple times you slide this off, it may be a little bit tighter than the following times. Okay. But again, wiggle that off. You may have to wiggle back and forth or slightly up and down as you're doing it. Pulling that off, now we can see the inner workings of the Upbox Plus extruder. The fan here actually has two duties. The fan on the top is most important duty is to cool the heatsink fins right here. So the heatsink fins need to be cooled. Otherwise, heat from the heater will start migrating up the tube, this heat break. This heat break tube is where the heat should not be migrating up, and it should be cooling here. So we want to keep this heat break as cool as possible, which is the duty of the heatsink. So we want to remove the air from the fins of the heatsink as expeditedly as possible. We use the fan to do that. But the petcock here on the side of the fan shroud actually is going to then direct that exhaust either out the front of the extruder shroud coming toward the door, and that's for ABS printing, where you do not want to cool the part itself as it's being printed if it's a warp prone material. PLA is not a warp prone material and it likes to be cooled. It helps it keep its sharp shape and geometry during printing, which will then redirect the fan current after it goes past the heatsink down towards the nozzle and the extruded material. All right, so now that we have this open, we understand the petcock. The next task we have is just to remove these two small Allen screws to make the gear accessible to us to clean out. So just quickly remove these. You want to make sure that when you do put these screws back in to hold this extruder gear cover, you do not crank these screws down tightly. You don't want to crush this Delrin plastic piece. Now we can see here we have a little bit of debris on the inside of here. We can wipe this out. We can tend to the bearing that's in here. We can wipe the bearing off, so that will wipe out quite easily. Get a paper towel, a Q-tip, something of the sort, a little brush. And then likewise, we need to come in here to the gear. I have a number of tools I like using depending on what amount of debris is stuck in here. This one isn't too bad. If it's been sitting here chewing up some filament and stripping it out, air printing, so we call it, it would have possibly a lot of debris caked into the gears. So in the teeth of the gear, you'll want to go through there with a small, one of the tools that we like to use is a little brass bristled brush or a little steel bristled brush. Either way, you can gently clean out from between the teeth with something like that. In the case of plastic being really kind of caked and stuck in there, where I can't just brush it out, you can use a little needle and you can kind of just push these pieces right straight out from each and individual tooth. So let's go around there. You can turn the gear by hand and clean out all of those teeth. If you leave a plastic bit, it's all caked in one or two teeth in there, this may prevent the gear from grabbing that area, and it will begin slipping in that spot, and it will show these artifacts in the print as well. Not to mention this will slowly start caking up with more and more filament on the adjacent teeth as well. So make sure you get those all cleaned out. Once they're cleaned out, you can quite simply just put this extruder gear cover back on. Again, don't crank the screws down too tightly. You can just get them, you don't want the screws to wiggle loose either. Make sure everything is good and tight up here. This is your heater and your thermistor cable. So should the heater or thermistor ever fail on this, this is a replaceable component. You can quite simply just unplug it here. The replacement heaters do come with a new 0.4 nozzle attached to them. They are $90, so you don't replace them unless you need to. I mention this because in the event that you're replacing a nozzle on your heater, on your nozzle heater, which is a more commonly replaceable part, is the nozzle itself, not necessarily the whole heater. So in the case of the nozzle replacement, it is critical to make sure that the nozzle has been warmed up via a extrude or withdrawal process in UpStudio. Make sure you get the filament out anyway, so hit withdrawal. But then if the nozzle is cool, at the time of removal of the nozzle, you'll want to heat it up again. Make sure you do heat up the nozzle to withdraw your filament. Or not to withdraw the filament, but to unscrew the nozzle. When unscrewing it, if it's cold, what can happen is the thin tube here, the heat break is a thin walled hollow tube because your filament passes through there. If the nozzle is cold or the heater is cold when you're removing the nozzle and you're doing this, it can actually twist the heat break, and it can bend it, twist it, or damage it in some way in which your filament will not pass through it very easily, not without scoring itself or scratching or bumping and rubbing against the edge of it, which it should not do through the process there. So a bent heat break can have the nozzle running, the filament running down and brushing up against one of the sides of it, and if it were, then it would also cause potential clogging, jamming, especially of lower temperature materials such as PLA. This can even cause problems with ABS as well, though not as much because it is a higher temperature resistant material. All right, so once that's back on, understanding the heat break and all of those good parts, this will just slide back on the front. You do want to make sure that you're not bumping the heatsink here. Just that will prevent it from going on. A lot of people will go to push this on, and when they do, they will just begin bumping like that. They can't push it on all the way. It's because we're hitting the heatsink, so just kind of wiggle that and get it under the heatsink and push on. Plug your two fans back in, and then your one Allen bolt to hold this back in the printer. Once it's back in, it has a little magnet still set in there. One screw to hold that back in nice and tight, and plug your CFC cable back in the top, little plastic cover if you wish, and you're ready to go.